Hello! Woman in the Dunes continued. When we left Jumpy, he had bitterly conceded to the village's demand that he serve as the woman's male partner and help her remove sand each night. He knows he can't live without food and water. As the couple begins digging out the accumulated sand that night, and the woman explains why she remains in the dunes, he finds himself mystified. And it's clear as they speak that she and Jumpy are using concepts that the other simply cannot understand, highlighting Teshigara's concern with the breakdown of communication in post-war Japan. While the couple's spontaneous lovemaking was a moment of passionate communication, the words they exchange as they shovel illustrate the barriers to their mutual understanding. Have a look.
こんなことをしていて、虚しいとは思わないのかな。生きるために砂かきをしてるんだか、砂かきをするために生きてるんだか。
そりゃ東京みたいに面白いことはないかもしれないけ
ど。東京のことなんか言ってるんじゃないよ。そんなこっちゃない。こんな風に閉じ込められっぱなしでよく我慢してられるな、本当に。
だって私の家なんだから。
だったら余計にもっと権利を主張すべきじゃないのかね。まあ僕の場合はいずれ助けがやってくるまでの辛抱だ。
助け？
だって当然じゃないか。1週間以上も無断欠勤が続けば誰かが僕の部屋を覗きに来るだろう。そうすりゃページを開けたままの読み差しの本だとか、小銭を入れたままの背広のポケットだとか。嫌でも僕の思想に不信を抱かざるを得ないわけだからな。しかし君の場合は黙ってれば一生の問題なんだぞ。
だってここには骨もうずまってるんだし。
骨？
ええ、死んだ父ちゃんのも娘のもね。
じゃあそれを掘り出せばここを離れてもいいんだろう。すぐにでも手伝うよ。君ならどう言えば連中に縄ばしごをかけさせられるか要領も分かってるだろうし。
表行ったって別にすることがあるじゃなし。
いや歩けばいいさ。
歩く？
そうさ。自由に歩き回れるってことは大したことなんだからな。
用もないのに歩き回ったりして余計にくたびれちゃうでしょ。
ふざけるなよせ。犬だって鎖につながれっぱなしで気が狂っちまうんだ。おまけに人間なんだろう。
だって砂がなかったら誰も私のことなんか構っちゃくれないんだから。そうでしょ、お客さんだって。
Both Jumpy and the woman invoke concepts that are too alien for the other to grasp. When he asks her why she stays in what he regards as a state of absurd and powerless entrapment, she says simply, "Because it is my home." Home is a concept that the rootless Junpei cannot grasp, even though he's drawn to the idea. He likes the idea of a home-cooked meal, and he certainly dislikes the deracinated, anonymous life he'd been leading in Tokyo. But he doesn't grasp the psychological and emotional ties that bind this woman to the pit where she lives. It's partly, she says, that her husband and daughter are still buried there under the sand that collapsed over the chicken coop. But we know that when she speaks of home, the woman also means a sense of reciprocal support that she shares with the village, a sense of community belonging in the collective enterprise of sand removal. This activity of shoveling also defines her sense of home. Home is not just a domestic space that she inhabits. Home is the familiar daily routine of maintenance that sustains her. When Junpei tells her that she should leave, she said that there's nothing she could do in the world outside. Home is the collection of time-honored gestures that define her life and bind her to the community and to its local traditions. Every resident in the village participates in sand removal, both as a practical necessity for living, but also as a sustaining and binding nightly ritual. Junpei will approach an understanding of what the woman means here by home only at the end of the film, just as she is ironically being forced to leave her home for the first and perhaps only time. But for her part, the woman never really grasps the two concepts that Junpei speaks of in this scene, freedom and human rights. When he urges her to leave the pit so she could move through the world freely, this concept of liberty, personal liberty, seems not only frightening to her, but alien, incomprehensible. What would be the point of walking around freely, she wonders? She would have no direction in her movement, no routine to rely upon to structure her life, no sense of being. She says it would just be, quote, aimless and exhausting, because she can't conceive of exercising her will independently or purposefully outside the pit. Her failure to understand what Junpei means by freedom is linked to her inability to distinguish her own individual desires. Both as a woman and as a member of this ancient tribal culture, her wishes, insofar as they exist, must always be identical with the needs and the wishes of the community. It's not just she who needs Junpei, after all, but the entire village at large, of which she is a part, needs and requires him. So the idea of exercising personal agency outside the needs of the village is inconceivable to her. She doesn't even crave the limited mobility of the male villagers who patrol the dunes. The one personal desire she does have, arguably, is for sex, but she cites this as another reason for staying in the pit, for staying put. Quote, if it weren't for the sand, no one would bother about me. In other words, I could never have attracted you as my mate in the outside world, only in this place. Junpei knows that this is true, and the remark silences him. No less baffling to him, however, is the woman's declaration, essentially her resistance to Junpei's declaration of rights as a human being. He says, even dogs go crazy when they're cooped up, and we're human beings. Now, the Western principle of human rights and of some intrinsic dignity that distinguishes human beings from animals that he is invoking here is beyond the woman's understanding. Just as she claims no human rights for herself, so too she grants no human rights to the captive Junpei or to any of the other men that the village has trapped. For her, the Darwinian need for personal and collective survival through such strategic acquisitions eclipses any modern scruples about individual human rights formulated by political philosophers. Insofar as the principle of human rights is a cornerstone of ethical conduct, well, we recognize that the woman is, as I've noted, shockingly amoral. When Junpei next appears, he seems to be in the process of accommodating himself, inevitably, to his new life. In an aerial shot, we see him stalking and capturing the tiger beetle subspecies that he sought in making the trip. And note that he found it in the pit. Had he not been trapped there, he might never have trapped it. He shows the specimen to the woman proudly and later pulls her playfully into his lap. He even asks for a pair of scissors to trim his beard. That's a part of Junpei that has begun to find unexpected contentment in this routine. That's the part of Junpei that had wanted to escape Tokyo and discover something more real. But another part of him, and at this point a stronger part of him, still wants to assert his individual freedom and human rights by escaping. Looking at the scissors, he realizes that they could serve as an anchor to pull himself up with if only he could embed them at the cliff edge above the sand pit. Feigning a stomachache that night, he uses the woman's absence to fashion a rope made of twisted fabric, which he hides in the sand outside. The next day, he asks the woman to heat bath water for him so that he can assess the height of the cliffs outside unseen. When she interrupts him while he's doing it, we see the inner conflict that is developed in Junpei. Have a look.
何を考えてるの？
いや別に。あ、写真撮ってあげよう。そこへ立って。
いやだそんな。
いいじゃないか。笑って。ほら。はい。
ないんでしょ。
なぜ？
ラジオでもあれば気が紛れるんだろうけど、
ラジオ？
いろいろと世間のこともわかるし。
くだらん。
でも東京のことだってよくわかるし。
そういうことがくだらんと思ったからこそ昆虫採集なんか始めたりしたんじゃないか。なんだかわけのわからん人生なんかよりは昆虫図鑑にでも名前が載っかるのがよっぽど確かだからな。
でも気が紛れますからね、ラジオがあれば。
分かったよ。それより焼酎の残りを一杯やらないかい？
病人のくせして。
よく眠られるよ。
そんなもの飲まなくたってもう眠くて眠くて。
まあそう言わずにさ。
私は本当にダメだったら。
いいんだよ。今日はそんな気分なんだから。
もう湧いたかしら。
まあそう言わずにさ。
呆れた人ね。
そう、キュッと開けちゃって。
Refusing to tell the woman he's planning an escape attempt, Junpei changes the subject by offering to take her photograph. She's reluctant, but it's not just a simple mistrust of modern technology. After all, she offers to ask the village to acquire a radio for him, which they later do. Rather, she's afraid of the photograph, I think, as an individualizing portrait, one that would distinguish her, somehow set her apart. What she craves is the familiar and the collective. Now, despite the woman's efforts to make Junpei accept his captivity, she knows, at this point, that he still wants to leave. While he takes her picture to divert her from these suspicions, he also takes it because he wants to preserve an image of her after he has left. We're reminded of the way that he sat gazing at her before trying to leave that first morning after he arrived. Even then, he paused in the doorway as if trying to remember what she looked like, bound by that attraction to her. Now, the woman may also be uneasy with the photograph then because she senses the underlying intention to escape and to keep an image of her in his mind having escaped. Well, having never been to a city, the woman assumes incorrectly that Junpei must be missing the news of life in Tokyo. And so she imagines a radio would serve perhaps as a substitute that would allow him to accommodate himself to his new life better. But Junpei tells her no. Truthfully, what drove him to look for insects in the sand dunes was a desire to escape that noisy, impersonal world of Tokyo, and a desire to establish a distinctive personal and professional identity as an entomologist by finding the tiger beetle. Now, He has just found that beetle that would seem to confer that sense of self on him. A more tangible sense of self, he hopes, than the one defined in the city merely by official documents. It is, after all, this creature, a living being, okay? As we'll see, though, his primary sense of self in relationship is going to be with the woman. Now, Junpei is becoming aware that his life of captivity, then, has its strange satisfactions. But the scene ends with Junpei urging the woman to share a drink with him, knowing that sake will put her to sleep since she almost never drinks, and that will enable his attempt to escape. Again, she retreats from this unfamiliar at first. As a woman, she doesn't drink, but she wants to believe Junpei's invitation is motivated by genuine affection. So she smiles in close-up as she tastes the alcohol, probably for the first time, while he surreptitiously pours his own out. Then she bathes him like a dutiful wife as he stands naked. She's undoubtedly aroused by his nakedness and by the contact of her fingers with his skin, just as he was excited by her sleeping naked body and by the physical stimulation earlier of brushing sand from her body. In both scenes, note, the act of cleansing with sand or with water produces mutual arousal, evoked once again in extreme close-ups of skin, knotted muscles, clutching hands as the sand is being removed or the water being applied, and in both to the sound of the woman's heavy breathing. Now, even as Junpei is deceiving her here, as he's being bathed, their physical connection is genuine, and once again it leads to sex. This time, though, rather than showing that sexual connection fulfilled, Teshigahara cuts to the pair lying in bed afterward. Now, at this point, I'd like to consider, if only briefly, Mary Undone's thoughts on female spectatorship in the reading that I assigned to go with Woman in the Dunes. In that section of her essay, Doan builds on the psychoanalytic work of Laura Mulvey and Christian Metz. She agrees with Mulvey that since the days of silent cinema, film has constructed a voyeuristic scenario orchestrated for the visual and sexual pleasure of male viewers, one in which women are presented as scopophilic objects of male delectation, as sources of male fantasy, as a means to vicarious male pleasure through the male's identification with the male protagonist. But this leads Doan to pose a question. Quote, what is the female spectator? What can one say about her desire in relation to the process of imagining? Essentially, Doan suggests that there is no comparable pleasure for female viewers in most cinema because of the way in which film orchestrates the gendered gaze. The subjectivity of the male viewer is matched to that of the male protagonist. In this case, ours is matched to Junpei. We see the woman exclusively through his eyes when she appears, and certainly in those extended shots in which he looks over, his eyes rove over her naked body. Well, for Doan, a female viewer, particularly a heterosexual female viewer, can't inhabit that masculinized space of visual desire unless the female viewer wants to try playing the role of a male viewer in what Doan calls a kind of epistemological transvesticism. She sees it as quite unnatural. And even if a female viewer does this, she suggests there's no authentic scopophilic pleasure in this artificial transaction. Now, a second factor that inhibits visual pleasure for female viewers, Doan suggests, is a lack of distance or a lack of separation. Voyeuristic pleasure is, after all, founded upon a distance from the viewer to the object that heightens the viewer's desires. And males, she suggests, can sustain that distance because they don't identify with the woman who is being presented and objectified. The woman is at a distance from them in part because she is other. But Doan suggests that when female viewers see a woman, like the one in Woman in the Dunes, arrayed on screen in a voluptuous way, there is no sense of separation on her part from that female image. Rather, Doan's female spectator experiences what she calls a sense of overpresence, of plenitude, that creates a narcissistic identification with the female image, not a desire for the female image. unless perhaps, though she doesn't consider it, the female viewer is lesbian. Now, Teshika Hari's extreme close-ups of the woman's body parts would seem to make this feeling of overabundance, of smothering proximity, especially acute for a heterosexual female viewer. And this is exacerbated by the fact that we almost never inhabit the woman's visual perspective gazing at Jumpi, perhaps with the brief exception of when she looks at his body as she is bathing him, though that comes largely in a series of extreme close-ups. Now, in short then, the gender dynamics of Women in the Dunes seem strongly to support Doan's thesis. Well, as the woman lies sleeping, Jumpi, rather than gazing at her now, collects the shears, affixes them to a piece of tree limb. He then uncovers the rope that has been hidden in the sand, attaches the scissors, and climbs up to the roof of the house. In order to shorten the distance, he has to throw this scissors thing up to reach the cliff top. Now, as a gale blows and the sky darkens, his tosses finally secure that anchor. His plan has succeeded to this point, but his escape is short-lived. Have a look. The succession of shots in this escape sequence emphasize the steepness of the cliff and the difficulty of this vertical endeavor. We get a long shot of Junpei climbing the rope against the precipitous backdrop. Then, as he nears the top, we get a high-angle shot looking down on him as he struggles to the edge of the cliff, again intensifying our sense of the dangerous verticality. When he looks over the top, the camera is positioned just behind him to show the village men in a long shot in the distance moving. We know that they will catch him. And this is followed by a close-up of Junpei panting, anxious. We see it all on his face. Now, Junpei knows that he could be spotted because he's seen the men. And indeed, he is spotted, but only after the escape has proven impossible for another reason. Why? Because as wind-blown sand fills the air and the sun sets, Junpei becomes disoriented, unable to determine the direction he came from when he first arrived. Spending weeks underground without any sight of the surrounding landscape has also skewed his spatial orientation. Now, Teshigahara conveys Junpei's confusion here through a stunning combination of shots. As Junpei surveys the dunes, a high-angle shot pans a full 360 degrees around his head, suggesting vertigo and dislocation. And when Junpei begins running, Teshigahara gives us a tracking shot in which the camera follows his legs, but it is so close to the ground as to convey motion without any sense of direction. We see only his legs for much of it. And as Junpei stumbles up and down a sand dune in panic and uncertainty, the camera movements quickly suggest that same sense of uncertainty, because Teshigahara tracks this entire movement of the body that appears and disappears as it moves over these dunes with a handheld camera to suggest that shakiness and uncertainty. Along the way, Junpei eventually collides with a villager. He sets off barking dogs, and because of that noise, he is soon easily tracked by a group of men who are pursuing him with lighted torches. They rescue him from a patch of quicksand. Have a look.
Oi! 助けてくれ俺、こいつに捕まってな。すみません。このロープで引っ張ってください。まさかあんた、根っこを引き抜くようなわけにはいかんよ。なあ。
今掘り出してやっかんな。その板っきれに捕まってな。
しょっ。
しかし間に合ってよかったな。あの辺はあんた塩あんこってな。何もよりつかん物騒なとこだよ。おい、もう何人紛れ込んだっけな。
ハイキングかなんかに来た不安内なもんがおるかんの。
掘り返してみたら案外金目のもんが出てくるかもわからんぞ。写真機の2、3台ぐらいは間違いなく出てくるわ。
The villagers here knew that Junpei would never be able to escape. And in digging him out, they laugh at the thought of other unsuspecting, camera-carrying city dwellers who in the past wandered into this very spot and disappeared in the quicksand. Now, the quicksand is another version, one might say, of the pit that Junpei has climbed out of. And the tribe is there with shovels and boards in this familiar rescue to superintend his removal from this pit and return to another pit. Well, as Junpei descends the rope ladder on his way back, Teshigahara presents the pit as a dark abyss, but he also repeats that long shot that he used when Junpei climbed up on another rope in order to escape. His body is again dwarfed by the massive cliff wall. We cut then to a close-up of the woman as she stands in the doorway and watches with an expression not of anger, not even of betrayal, but only of sorrow. When we next see her, she's weeping. Having lost her husband, her greatest fear is abandonment. She tells Junpei that she goes to sleep each night, quote, frightened that I'll wake up alone again. Now, while the woman defines herself, as we've seen, in relation to the village, she is afraid of domestic loneliness. She needs to define herself also, as Junpei does, in relationship to a partner, to another human being. Well, far from sympathetic to her concerns, Junpei mutters, I failed, a complete and utter failure. Once again, he tries, however, to deceive himself by insisting that friends or the school board will somehow track him down and rescue him, but the fact that he then incinerates the collection of insects that he had hoped would establish his reputation in the outside world suggests that Junpei knows that those discoveries will never reach the city. From his descriptions of life in Tokyo, it's clear that no one there cares about him enough to search. He can simply vanish without a trace. Indeed, Junpei himself observes, quote, people only care about themselves. Now, this generalization, one could argue, also includes the woman, if we extend the idea of self-interest to the interests of the surrounding community that she shares. Because in addition to making money by stringing beads, we learn that the woman survives also economically by sifting and selling sand illegally at half price to factories, even though she knows that the buildings that sand contributes to in the mortar sometimes collapse because the sand is too salty. But the people who suffer there are not part of her tribe. She puts it, that's other people's business, unrelated to her. In his cynicism, Junpei helps her sift the defective sand a moment later. He cares even less about the city than she does, and he shows as little moral scruples in this as she does. Now, the woman, indeed, who I've described as fundamentally immoral, has begun to realize that while Junpei has tried to escape from his captivity there, he doesn't want to escape to anything in Tokyo. What's there for you, she asks him, and his failure to answer makes his lack of direction on leaving the pit that we saw all the more appropriate. There's nowhere he wants to go, so in a sense it's altogether fitting that he couldn't find his direction when he finally got up to the surface. Yet at this point, Junpei can't live without at least the illusory prospect of escape, even though he knows it's impossible. This cognitive dissonance of wanting to believe you can escape and knowing you can't is a survival strategy of his own. He digs his trap in the sand, in which Junpei hopes to lure crows. Much as he was lured himself into the sand pit, he wants to lure them into this little sand pit. As he puts it, quote, sometimes I want to be the one to set the trap. His idea that he could tie a note to a bird's leg and reach a liberator through this bird when he releases it is so fantastic as to be surreal in itself. Junpei realizes how fantastic it is, but he explains, quote, even if it's only a lie, it helps to have hope. That is, it helps to have the illusion of hope even if you know it's an illusion. This is, I think, why he petitions the village to allow him to come out of the pit for 10 minutes just to look at the sea, whose limitless expanse allows Junpei to sustain the illusion of the idea of freedom even though he knows he'll never achieve it. Just the illusion is seductive. Well, when the village agrees to grant his request, it comes at a price, and it comes on a night of atavistic village revelry, a festival that features masks, drum beats, ritual combats, and perverse sexual license. The villagers will honor Junpei's wish to look at the sea only if they're allowed to watch something themselves, to watch him and the woman have sex in the open. Teshigahara cuts between extreme high and low angle shots. Low angle shots as Junpei looks up at the masked faces and revelers high above on the cliff, and low angle shots as he looks up at them, and high angle shots as they look down upon him and the woman from their position of visual power and control. Now, the scene that follows is the film's most disturbing, I think, without question, because here Teshigahara reveals an element not merely of brutality in Junpei, but more particularly an element of depravity beneath not just his veneer of civilization, but also beneath the kind of communal bounds of support in the village. It's also the most surreal scene in the film because one might say of the incongruous mixture of domestic routine on the one hand, as the couple shovels sand in their front yard, and on the other, the fantastic carnivalesque figures who menace them from above. This juxtaposition of the ordinary, the quotidian, and the strange and fantastic. Finally, it is a scene that, in this surrealist film, produces the greatest shock effect. Junpei's attempted rape when the woman refuses to perform sexually for the crowd. Have a look. Now, heretofore, the village has protected the woman, and they have operated on a principle of mutual support. But now the grotesquely costumed mob, including a few women, demand to watch a sexual spectacle. Junpei, in his desperation to look at the sea, is willing, but the woman now, for the first and only time, separates her own will, which we scarcely knew existed, from that of the community. She will not be exploited for their amusement. It's not so much that she wants to exercise a desire as she wants to resist their desire. She says she will not, quote, just pretend to be having sex so that the crowd will be gratified and that Junpei can look at the sea. Now, the woman's familiar enough with these barbaric customs that seem to occur once a year to tell Junpei to ignore their perversity. But no less shocking than the mob's demand to see a sex show is how Junpei's desperation leads to the act of sexual violence. When he drags the woman out of the house, when she won't comply, she fights him off repeatedly and then beats him and sobs finally in exhaustion, "You idiot." She feels betrayed. Betrayed by the community, yes, but also betrayed by Junpei, whom she loves and whom she has hoped has at least valued her love. Well, their rift is temporary. When we next see the couple, two changes have occurred. First, Junpei unexpectedly has found the croat trap filled with fresh water. This discovery provides not just a distraction from his captivity, but ultimately it provides a reason for his staying in the woman's house and serving and being part of the surrounding community. Now, ironically, the phenomenon he scientifically terms capillary action is what the woman, in other words, had described when she first served him dinner, the idea that sand attracts moisture, something he had earlier rejected. The dune's dryness, it turns out, draws water up from below ground, acting like a suction pump. As Junpei outlines a model for perfecting his technique of sucking up the water, we realize that the trap he had set to indulge his desire or illusory belief in the possibility of escape is in fact now ironically giving him a purpose for remaining. The second decisive change is revealed when the woman says, "I'm afraid." She's afraid because she's pregnant, and having borne a daughter, she knows that the pain she feels now isn't normal. She has almost certainly an ectopic pregnancy, in which the fetus develops not in the womb, but in the fallopian tube. It is, if you think of it, this image of a fetus trapped in a fallopian tube, an image of life-threatening entrapment that in some ways recalls the image of the pit itself. Well, a cut shows Junpei signaling that they need help with a flare. He doesn't yet know that the woman's pregnant, but he knows that she needs medical attention, and the villagers, including a veterinarian, come, and he demands that she see a doctor. That can only occur, however, if she leaves the pit. As the village men are about to transfer the woman from her home to a hospital above the ground, Junpei shows not only compassionate concern for her, but now perhaps for the first time, real affection. Have a look.
収まったようだ。
どうする？布団ごとくるむで。やろう。これ板敷いた方がいいぞ。ラジオだよ。
ラジオだとさ。間が悪かったな。開けてみるかい。持っていくかい。
布団の中へ押し込んどけ。
As the woman lies doubled in pain, Junpei rubs her back gently. She's afraid not just of the malformed pregnancy inside her, but afraid of leaving home. Note that when the couple speaks here, the camera moves fluidly now from one to the other, connecting them, rather in the shot reverse shot editing cuts that we've seen when they converse earlier. The radio that the woman requested to placate Junpei arrives just as she's leaving, but Junpei has no interest in the news of Tokyo now. Instead, he turns on music and gives the radio to the woman to comfort her as she leaves. Knowing the men will be taking her into a town, he is about to give one of them a scientific notebook that he has compiled, but then he hesitates and says, some other time. Junpei still thinks of that different life in the future in which his scientific discoveries about insects might win him some measure of fame, but he's not ready to leave, even if he could leave, and so he doesn't want his notebooks published. His discovery of the water and his feeling of something like love for the woman are holding him there. He doesn't even want to be tempted by the outside world at this moment, notwithstanding this illusion that he maintains and knows it's an illusion that he might someday leave. Well, as the woman is lifted into a net, out and up above the cliff, she repeats, no, no, no. She's referring not, I think, primarily to the loss of her child, or even potentially the loss of her own life, but rather, I think, the loss of the man whose support she has finally gained, and what she fears is the loss of her home. Junpei stands in the door, watching her go up now as she had stood in the doorway earlier after his escape attempt, watching him come down. In a close-up, we see that Junpei's face reveals worry, but there's also a look of bewilderment, perhaps at the irony that is she, not he, who is leaving now. But there's also a look of amazement at this. Amazement, perhaps, on Junpei's part at what he now knows are his feelings for this woman who has trapped him, and even more amazement at his inclination to remain alone in her house. When the village delegation carelessly leaves the rope ladder hanging down, Junpei approaches it, hesitates, and only then climbs up. When he gets to the edge, he doesn't rush about as he'd done before trying to orient himself to get away. Instead, he climbs directly to the top of a sand dune to look at the ocean that he has so long wanted to see. Have a look.
別に慌てて逃げ出したりする必要はないのだ。私の往復に一歩には行く先も戻る場所も本人の自由に書き込める余白になって空いている。おまけに私の心は貯水装置のことを誰かに話したいという欲望ではち切れそうになっている。話すとなればここの部落のもの以上の聞き手はまずありえまい。 今日でなければ多分明日私は誰かに打ち明けてしまっていることだろう。逃げる手立てはまたその翌日にでも考えればいいことである。
We see Jumpy here as he first appeared in the film, trudging through the dunes with a purpose, but it's a different purpose now. The sea represents liberation for him still, but now it's not the kind of liberation that he had imagined earlier. It's not freedom from something that he was seeking when he left Tokyo, but now it is associated, the sea, I think, with a sense of freedom through working for something that will involve water, like the sea itself. Jumpy has ceased to feel like a captive. He experiences freedom then in a very different sense. In this case, it is the existential freedom to create himself as he wishes in this place outside urban society that had earlier defined his identity only through a compilation of legal and contractual documents. It's the freedom to be something else in relation to a surrounding community, and if she comes back, in relation to the woman. As Jumpy says in a voiceover, quote, "I'm free to write in my own origin and destination." Well, the woman's house is now his freely chosen destination. Thus, Teshigahara's film concludes with two amazing paradoxes. First, Jumpy finds genuine freedom in his confinement, and second, he finds what is most authentic in himself in a surreal situation, in what seems like a surreal world. Well, seeing his footsteps in the sand, Jumpy follows them back to the pit out of which he had climbed, where he immediately goes to inspect his water pumping system. Looking up, he sees a child peeking at the top of the sand cliff. And this leads Jumpy to reflect that he's, quote, bursting with desire to share his knowledge, this knowledge of how to get water in this dry community. He wants to share it now, this science, not with students as he had as a teacher, not with a scientific journal, not with anyone in the city, but rather with the villagers, both for their benefit and from his. And note that as he looks at this water that he has collected, he sees in it his own reflection. It's as if he recognizes who he is in this moment for the first time in this place in relation to the woman, in relation to the community that he is serving. This man, whose identity in Tokyo consisted of nothing more than a set of official records, has acquired a sense of self based on his relationship with another human being and a sense of communal identity within a tribe that ironically had abducted him. Oh yes, he still plays now and then with the thought of escape, but again, as a kind of mental strategy more than anything else, because it is no longer for Jumpy at the end of this film even anything like a real desire. Now, we don't know the fate of the woman, though I think we may assume that she lives and returns. We learn after 7 years that Jumpy himself has not surprisingly not returned to the city. A missing persons report finally discloses to us his name, as if that name itself were part of the artificial identity constructed around him in the city. The report is the final document in Jumpy's file, which, for official purposes, constitutes his life in the city. Now he has vanished officially, but Jumpy, it seems, has found his real life and real sense of self elsewhere. Okay. Well, I hope you found Woman in the Dunes as strange and mesmerizing as I do. We turn our attention now to Ingmar Bergman and Cries and Whispers. And in doing so, we move from surrealism to cinematic expressionism. Now, Bergman did not always work in this particular stylistic idiom, but Cries and Whispers is one of the most extraordinary works of expressionistic filmmaking, I think, ever created. Like Surrealism, Expressionism originated as a phenomenon in the visual arts. But unlike Surrealism, it also developed as an actual movement within silent filmmaking, not just as a style. German Expressionism, as it's called, emerged and flourished in Berlin beginning about 1920 with Robert Wien's bizarre film The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and it continued into the early 1930s, culminating in Fritz Lang's masterpiece M. Now, there were several directors working within this movement, but the three leading figures were the German, F.W. Murnau, the Dane, Karl Dreyer, and the Austrian Fritz Lang. Their development of Expressionism in film grew directly out of Expressionistic painting in Northern Europe at the turn of the 20th century, especially the avant-garde canvases of artists like Van Gogh and Kandinsky and Edvard Munch. Like Expressionistic painters, Expressionist filmmakers attempted to evoke in visual images the interior emotional and psychic states of characters. Expressionism sought to express in outward form the thoughts and feelings and instinctive urges and liminal states of interior consciousness, and even, often, the unconscious. These filmmakers shared these interests in subliminal consciousness with the Surrealists, of course, but the Expressionist methods differed. To evoke interior life, Expressionist directors experimented with things like indirect lighting, and most famously with shadows, with distorted angles and strange abstract shapes in the set design. They used oversized props that became psychosymbolic. They used exaggerated camera perspectives and distorted landscapes in the mise en scène. Now, German Expressionist filmmakers were especially drawn to disturbed, agitated, abnormal states of subjectivity, a rather morbid psychological fascination. Their cinemascapes are usually nightmarish, phantasmagoric projections of the powerful psychic states and feelings of anguish, terror, guilt, entrapment, illicit desire, and especially hysteria. Now, some of these visualized feelings originate in the conscious minds of characters in Expressionist films, while others evoke their subconscious states. From the start, Expressionist films were designed then to do more than tell stories. They are meant to evoke dark mental atmospheres, the mind in an extreme state. And what of all possible extreme states of mind could be more extreme than the approach of death? Indeed, death haunts nearly all great works of cinematic expressionism, and especially German expressionism. But as David Cook notes, the visual inscription of subjective reality on screen was more challenging, say, for filmmakers than for expressionist painters like Van Gogh for this reason, because film was regarded as an objective medium. The camera was thought to capture external reality accurately and dispassionately and objectively. Now, as we saw in Antonioni's blow-up, one can easily subvert that premise. But for the German expressionists, the question became, how could the camera's representation of external reality also be made to reflect turbulent interior life? The challenge then for them was to create mise en scène that would look realistic but was inflected with special lighting, camera angles, and props that would evoke a tortured mind, a tortured interior state, either individual consciousness or the individual unconsciousness, or, in works like Lang's M, evoke the collective psyche of an entire panic-stricken and hysterical city. Now, to give you an idea of the techniques and effects of German Expressionism, the tradition that Bergman inherits and employs in Cries and Whispers, here's a famous clip you may be familiar with from one of the movement's defining works, F.W. Murnau's 1922 horror classic Nosferatu. This is the original vampire film, and still I think the most intelligent and disturbing. Murnau uses the vampire's exaggerated shadow to transmit a sense of the victim's terror of imminent death. Shadows are literally, if you think of it, projections of external material forms. but the Expressionist directors used them primarily to register interior reality. Now, in the scene you're about to watch, the Nosferatu has migrated from Transylvania to London. And at night, he looks across the street and he sees a woman. She's the wife of the man whom he had encountered in his native land years before. And as he stares at the woman, she becomes mesmerized under his influence. She wakes from sleep at his summoning, struggles against both his evil influence and her own sexual desire, which he has conjured. Then she rouses her husband and tells him to run for help because she feels endangered. And of course, it is his departure that then allows the Nosferatu to cross the street, mount her stairs, and destroy her. Have a look. The look of desperate erotic yearning on the face of the solitary predator is almost moving, even as it horrifies us. Murnau crosscuts between the victim and the vampire to increase tension until the two come together and the Nosferatu's gigantic shadow begins to spread and cover the woman. It's a manifestation, this shadow, of death, but also the visual expression of the woman's mounting fear and her sexual enchantment. Prior to this, we see the vampire's shadow famously moving up the wall. We don't see his body, only the elongated shadow, which, as it mounts and increases in size, suggests his irresistible power over the mind and body of his victim. Now, some have argued that the shadow that we see there is meant to remind the viewer that we're watching a film and thereby provide a kind of opportunity to disavow the terrible horror that we feel that is oppressing us as we see this. Well, we see other expressionistic features in the distorted makeup and dress of the mise en scène. The vampire is skeletal. His head is like a naked skull. His back is hunched. His eyes are leering and gigantic. In short, he is a predatory creature from Nightmare made visible. Still another expressionistic technique on display here is the framing of extreme facial expressions in close-up. We're going to see a great deal of this in Bergman. We don't see the vampire enter the woman's bedroom. Rather, we see her response to his entry in a close-up, in an extreme instance of a reaction shot. Having wakened from a dark dream, she is now living a dark dream. The expressionistic directors discovered that enlarged face could itself become a kind of screen on which feelings would be registered, and the woman's face is a kind of screen here. Perhaps the most famous use of this method of close-ups as expressionistic is Carl Dreyer's silent film, The Passion of Joan of Arc, much of which is shot in overpowering, claustrophobic close-ups of Joan as she faces death. Standing trial for witchcraft, her features register states of anguish and doubt and faith. Now, a final expressionistic technique worth noting is the inclusion of strange, unfamiliar objects in the mise en scène, not for the sake of incongruity, as in surrealism, but rather as expressionistic correlatives to the protagonist's disturbed psyche. One brilliant use of this element is in Lang's 1932 film M. It's about a deranged serial killer in Berlin. He's named Beckert, and he stalks and preys on young girls. When he sees one, he is so overcome by an uncontrollable compulsion to eroticized murder that he cannot control himself at all. Beckert struggles to explain this pathology in words, even to himself, but Lang evokes this condition, this psychosexual illness, in the language of abstract objects that the killer observes as he is stalking a girl one day. He sees these objects in a store window. Have a look.
Ach, Mutti, ich bin dir entgegengelaufen. Aber Kind, das sollst du doch nicht. Du weißt doch warum.
As Beckert follows the adolescent girl, he's whistling a tune from Grieg's Peer Gynt. The spiraling, the tune he always whistles when he's overcome by this erotic pathology. The spiraling disc in the window suggests his almost hypnotic state, the crazed condition of his mind as he's drawn toward his quarry, drawn by a compulsion beyond his conscious control. The arrow gyrating up and down evokes Beckert's desire to penetrate his victim, both with the knife that will, he hopes, kill her, and also penetrate her sexually. He carries that knife with him. Now, as the girl escapes, the maniac gazes at these two objects, the disc and the arrow, moving in the window, in a moment of what looks like self-recognition. He can't explain his condition in words, but these distorted, strange forms seem to embody it. Now, Bergman's expressionism in Cries and Whispers will incorporate many of the techniques that I have just described. We'll have shadows, long close-ups of the dying woman's face and her sister's faces, and a variety of psychosexual objects, as well as a blurring of dream and reality. But above all, we'll see something in Cries and Whispers that wasn't possible in the black and white cinema of the German Expressionists, and that is the overpowering presence of a single color as expressionistic device. The color red. The red interior of the room where Agnes is dying, and the red of the entire manor house engulfs everything, and the color red continues even in the transitions from scene to scene. Bergman makes red as inescapable as death. But the color red is complex because it evokes different feelings and states of mind at different points in the film and depends very much on the character. It evokes certainly the agony of Agnes's dying, but it also evokes at different moments rage, erotic passion, the womb, birth, and self-mutilation, depending on the moment and depending on the character. And this expressionistic color is linked to various red substances in the film as well, including blood and wine. More broadly, Bergman said that he used red as an all-enveloping shade in the film to convey, quote, the color of the soul. Now, this might suggest a spiritual membrane, but the word soul is always ambiguous and vexed in Bergman's work because throughout his long career, he so often poses the central existential question of whether we possess a soul or not, and the answer is usually no. So, ultimately, I think when he talks about the color of the soul here, he's referring less to an numinous part of our being, and rather to the soul as a kind of state of mind or interior mode of being. But as we'll see, questions of faith, questions of God are always on Bergman's mind, even if most often his response is to deny the existence of a God and a soul. Now, we've seen elements of Expressionism in other filmmakers that we've studied, particularly Tarkovsky and Bertolucci, but never as dominant a form of Expressionism as we're going to see in Cries and Whispers. Now, Bergman was unquestionably deeply familiar with and influenced by the German Expressionist, but as I've noted, he didn't always or even consistently operate in an expressionistic cinematic idiom. Rather, his films draw on a variety of styles as they seek relentlessly to penetrate the deepest strata of his characters' troubled minds. Now, since the 1950s, Bergman has been synonymous with serious cinema. He's a director of such metaphysical ambition, psychological depth, and experimental daring that his films were and still are the staples of art houses and college colloquia. When I was your age, if you wanted to impress a date with your intellectual sophistication, you took her or him to a Bergman film, and the bleaker the better. And then you talked earnestly over coffee about The Magician or Hour of the Wolf or Cries of Whispers. Now, many critics share Woody Allen's conviction that Bergman is, quote, probably the greatest film artist, all things considered, since the invention of the motion picture camera. But not all. I've known serious and intelligent film specialists who regard Bergman as pretentious, ponderous, pointlessly obscure. But most film critics and film historians, I think, regard him as a towering and indispensable figure in world cinema, unique, influential, and prodigiously talented. No one before Bergman ever used film so ambitiously as a medium for philosophical and psychological investigation. He invested movies with the intellectual heft and complexity that we find in modern writers like Thomas Mann and William Faulkner. And his use of memories and dreams and hallucinations to evoke repressed parts of the psyche is akin, I think, to the techniques we find in Joyce's Ulysses or to the plays of Bergman's Swedish forebearer, August Strindberg. Now, working well into his 80s, Bergman was so prolific that his career really has to be marked by phases, sort of like Picasso's in painting or T.S. Eliot's in poetry. Bergman grew up in Sweden, the son of a severe and rather ferocious Lutheran minister. And though he rebelled against his religious indoctrination in a rather narrow faith, nonetheless, Bergman remained throughout his life preoccupied with religious questions, not only speculating on God's existence, as I've noted, but exploring man's unanswered longing for a God who remains elusive and invisible. Now, unlike Tarkovsky, Bergman rarely finds a call to faith in God's invisibility. Rather, that invisibility produces angst among the living and the fear that we inhabit a merely godless and purposeless universe. His career as a filmmaker began really with screenwriting. In the 1940s, he was a screenwriter, and indeed, he wrote screenplays for nearly all of the films he made because he is a quintessential auteur. But his early directorial efforts after screenwriting were undistinguished at first, largely failures. His first critical breakthrough came in 1952 in a film called Monica. It's about an irresponsible girl who has a summer fling with a boy she meets, gets pregnant, and then leaves him holding the baby at the end of the film. This shocked and fascinated audiences in Sweden. And Bergman's next film, Sawdust and Tinsel, was even more daring and even more controversial. Here, the tortured owner and ringmaster of a circus tries to reconcile with his estranged wife while becoming increasingly jealous as a young performer seduces his girlfriend. Now, to render these psychosexual states, Bergman drew here for the first time on German expressionistic techniques, particularly dream sequences, one in which a clown in the circus watches his wife humiliate him. Well, reviled in Sweden, the film's style, nonetheless, attracted international attention. And beginning in the mid-1950s, Bergman then directed a series of masterpieces that comprise the first major phase of his career. These films address four major themes that recur throughout his entire career. First, the quest for self-knowledge. Second, the struggle to find God. Third, the status of the artist, which he returns to periodically. And fourth, of course, death, that haunts almost all of his films. But this first phase began with one of Bergman's most uncharacteristic films, Smiles of a Summer Night, a social comedy inspired by Renoir's Rules of the Game. Well, the film's international success gave Bergman the prestige and freedom to explore darker themes, and he certainly did. By then, he had attracted a cadre of extraordinary actors, of the likes of which I think you can only compare, say, to Orson Welles and the Mercury Theater. Actors who he would use again and again throughout his career, including Ingrid Thulin, who plays Karen in Cries and Whispers. Bergman's greatest films, as I've noted, are almost always death-haunted, and the experience or fear or anticipation of death dominates his worldview in this first phase of his work, particularly and most famously in his best-known film, The Seventh Seal, made in 1956. Set during the plague in the 14th century Sweden, it's an apocalyptic allegory about a knight back from the Crusades who seeks God while also fleeing death. The mise-en-scène is unforgettably iconographic. A black-hooded figure of death extends his cape, flagellants whip themselves, the grim reaper leads plague victims in a dance of death across the hills, and the knight plays chess with death to save his body and soul. Have a look.
Vem är du?
Jag är döden.
Kommer du för att hämta mig?
Jag har redan länge gått vid din sida.
Det vet jag.
Är du beredd?
Min kropp är rädd. Inte jag själv. Vänta ett ögonblick.
Så säger ni alla. Men jag lämnar inga uppskov.
Du spelar ju schack, inte sant?
Hur vet du det?
Ja. Jag har sett det på målningar och hört i visorna.
Ja, jag är verkligen en ganska skicklig schackspelare.
Du kan ändå inte vara skickligare än jag.
Varför vill du spela schack med mig?
Det är min sak.
Det har du rätt i.
Villkoret är att jag får leva så länge jag står dig emot. Spelar jag dig matt, förger du mig. Du fick svart.
Det passar ju bäst så. Inte sant?
Another great work of the 1950s, Wild Strawberries, is thematically closer to Cries and Whispers than any other Bergman film. It's about an old man facing death and pondering the value of his existence as he struggles toward some kind of self-knowledge. The film isn't expressionistic per se, the way Cries and Whispers is, but it does feature memory sequences of the kind we do get in Cries and Whispers, and it also features terrifying symbol-laden dreams that are often a staple of Expressionism. These dreams include one that the aging protagonist Isaac has the night before he's supposed to receive a lifetime award, as he's a doctor, at a university town. The dream propels his self-examination for the rest of the film. Have a look.
På efternatten, lördag den 1 juni, hade jag en egendomlig och mycket obehaglig dröm. Jag drömde att jag under min morgonpromenad hade förirrat mig till en för mig okänd stadsdel med öde gator och förfallna hus.
In this dream, Isaac sees himself in the coffin and recoils from death, just as he earlier sees a faceless man in this empty street and turns away. If the faceless man suggests his lack of self-understanding, the image of himself in the coffin suggests his fear of imminent death. And he turns away from both, just as he dodges the broken wheel from the hearse, because he's terrified of looking into himself. He's terrified of death. But note that as he looks at his own face in this coffin, Isaac also is face-to-face with his failure to live, face-to-face with the cold deadness that has been his life, a state reflected in the dream landscape itself, with its bare, desolate streets where he finds himself wandering alone. Now, the failure of compassion that has blighted Isaac's life, his fatal coldness, also, as we shall see, afflicts Karen in Cries and Whispers, though unlike Isaac, she never achieves a transformative breakthrough as she watches her sister die. A number of Bergman's films probe that condition of coldness that we see in Karen and we see in Isaac in The Artist, in what amounts to a kind of self-scrutiny on Bergman's own part. As, for example, in The Magician, one of his first meditations on the artist, a film full of self-reflexive cinematic illusions. It's about a strange man who brings a magic lantern device to a town, a primitive film apparatus that he uses to delude and frighten a gullible family. Here Bergman reflects on the delusive power of movie-making and its potential abuses. The final film of this early period, The Virgin Spring, returns to the Middle Ages and the quest for God that we see in The Seventh Seal. Here a young girl is raped and murdered on her way to church, and her father slaughters the killers in revenge. When he finds his daughter's body in the woods, he vows to build a church on the spot, and a spring miraculously wells up. Is this, as some have argued, a sign of divine forgiveness, or is it a reward for the man's faith, or both? Well, some have tried to read Bergman's entire career as a tortured affirmation of God, and they pay particular attention to this film. But most of the films that follow The Virgin Spring most definitely don't embrace a Christian vision. Rather, the search for belief yields only doubt and despair. The second and probably bleakest phase of Bergman's career came in the early and mid-1960s with an existentialist trilogy united by tone and vision. Through a Glass Darkly, Winter Light, and The Silence, all three are works of almost unbearable solemnity and suffocating psychological misery, composed of symbols that evoke angst. Faces in close-up become maps of hopelessness and incipient madness. The concern now isn't for finding God, as it was in The Seventh Seal or Virgin Spring, but rather now the emphasis is on living in the absence of God, in the absence of belief. Why live at all? The overriding question in the trilogy is why cruelty and suffering exist, and Bergman's answer seems to be that the world is simply too malignant to imagine that any God could possibly have created it. Now, stunning as these films are in their bleakness, Bergman had reached a metaphysical and aesthetic dead end with them. A third phase, then, led him to revisit long-standing themes through experimental and self-reflexive methods. Persona, his most difficult and enigmatic work, explores the mysteries of identity and the forces that inhibit coherent self-knowledge. The Passion of Anna from this third phase is set on a barren island where four angst-ridden individuals are menaced by rumors of a homicidal maniac who embodies not just their fear of death, but also their fear of their own existence. Cries and Whispers, made in 1972, marks a fourth phase, focusing now intensely in Bergman's work on human relationships. It is, I think, unquestionably one of his most harrowing works, but it is also, I believe, his most moving and ultimately, I think, his greatest film. There are long stretches of silence in Cries and Whispers, broken by the dying woman's cries and whispers alone, and that places tremendous emphasis on the purely visual, expressionistic elements of the film. Bergman's later years, his final years, brought the searing family relationships Fanny and Alexander and Autumn Sonata, as well as Scenes from a Marriage, which chronicles the disintegration of a marriage ending in divorce and new partners. Well, Bergman certainly knew about such things. He was married 5 times, divorced 4 times, had 9 children by 5 different women, including one by Liv Ullmann, the actress who plays Maria in Cries and Whispers, to which I will devote my entire next lecture.